was at the store.
You want kids, right?
We both do.
Well, you know, having a family takes money. Get angry or lose your temper.
Well, that's the purpose of the whole exercise. This is a good start. To feel what you feel.
Deserves a throne, and we've got one with your name on it. Here, at Captain Carlo.
No way.
Mark, you good?
Turn the camera off.
No, it's good. It's outtake stuff, dude.
Turn the fucking camera off.
I'm no expert, but I checked earlier and everything looks okay.
You said the lights flicker.
Yeah, whole store does. Just not at the same time. One night I lose the power upstairs, next night it's down here. There's no rhyme or...
Do you ever feel like you're living behind glass, watching life happen, but never...
Evolving. But as you walk through life, the untrained mind can start to build walls, put up barriers.
Hello?
A furniture showroom is supposed to make space feel harmless. Its rooms are arranged, measured, and staged to suggest that every object has a purpose and every doorway leads somewhere sensible. In Backrooms, that promise fails. A strange opening appears beneath an ordinary commercial building, and the architecture stops behaving like architecture. The walls still resemble something built for people, yet the place seems to have forgotten what people are for. That contradiction gives Kane Parsons' 2026 film its most unsettling advantage. The backrooms are not frightening because they look completely alien. They are frightening because they look almost usable. The lights work. The carpet continues. Corners imply another room, and another room implies a route. Everything offers the visual grammar of a normal interior while refusing the one thing normal interiors provide: orientation. Even the emptiness carries a social trace. These rooms resemble places meant to be occupied, maintained, sold, or passed through, so their abandonment never feels peaceful. It feels delayed, as though human activity should resume at any moment but never does. The silence becomes less an absence than a broken appointment between the space and the people it appears to expect. Cinema deep view begins here, before the plot can explain the doorway or the people drawn through it. When every surface appears familiar, what tells us that we still belong in the space around us? And when a building keeps repeating the signs of safety without delivering safety itself, how long can reason remain useful? That question shapes the film more than any creature, chase, or sudden disturbance. Backrooms understands that fear often begins as a problem of interpretation. A person enters a room and tries to read it. Where is the exit? What is this place designed to do? Who might have been here before? The ordinary mind searches for intention because intention makes an environment manageable. A corridor has a destination. A door separates two meaningful areas. A light exists so someone can see. Parsons places those assumptions under pressure by giving us spaces that preserve the appearance of design after purpose has disappeared. This also changes the meaning of escape. In a conventional maze, the challenge is finding the correct route through a fixed structure. Here, the deeper threat is uncertainty about whether a correct route exists at all. Each new passage can feel like progress while quietly returning the traveler to the same emotional position, hopeful enough to continue, disoriented enough to make another mistake. Movement becomes difficult to distinguish from repetition. The film's human premise intensifies that uncertainty. A disappearance draws a therapist toward the dimension beyond the doorway, turning a professional relationship built on observation and interpretation into a physical search through a place that resists both. Therapy depends on patterns becoming legible. The backrooms offer patterns everywhere, but legibility nowhere. Repetition may be a clue, a trap, or simply the shape of the environment. Familiarity may calm the mind, even when familiarity is the very mechanism keeping it lost. So the guiding question is not simply whether someone can find an exit. It is whether the habits we use to understand reality can become liabilities when reality no longer follows human logic. When every doorway promises escape, how does Backrooms turn familiarity itself into the most dangerous trap? The film's first achievement, then, is not creating a strange world. It is making an almost ordinary world feel untrustworthy. Before judging how fully it develops that idea, we need to establish what kind of horror experience it actually offers, what it prioritizes over straightforward explanation, and where its control begins to weaken. The first thing Backrooms asks from its audience is patience with uncertainty. It belongs to horror, science fiction, and mystery at the same time, but it doesn't behave like a film eager to define its rules. The central space is introduced as a physical impossibility, yet the movie resists treating it as a puzzle box that can be solved through enough exposition. Its priority is the feeling of entering a system that looks designed but may not have been designed for human understanding. That choice immediately separates the film from a straightforward creature feature. It also changes what counts as suspense, because the question is not merely what might appear, but whether the environment itself can be read at all. There are threats inside the maze, and the possibility of pursuit gives the story a pulse, but fear doesn't depend entirely on waiting for something to attack. The more effective tension comes from scale, repetition, and the collapse of ordinary spatial judgment. A corridor can be wide enough to feel exposed and still seem claustrophobic because it offers no reliable direction. An empty room can become threatening simply by appearing too deliberate, as though its lack of purpose has been arranged. For viewers familiar with Kane Parsons' online work, the expectation is naturally tied to found footage, incomplete evidence, and the strange authenticity of images that seem recovered rather than composed. The feature preserves part of that unease, although it also has to do something the shorter pieces could avoid: sustain characters, emotional stakes, and narrative momentum across a full-length drama. That expansion is both the film's opportunity and its first source of friction. Its strongest immediate quality is control of atmosphere. Backrooms rarely needs to overstate that a place is wrong. The design, the depth of the frames, the persistent electrical presence, and the awkward relationship between bodies and architecture do most of the work. The film understands that a room becomes unnerving when we can see enough to search it, but not enough to trust what we have seen. It repeatedly places the audience in that unstable position, scanning backgrounds, measuring distances, and wondering whether stillness is genuine or temporary. The performances help prevent this atmosphere from becoming a technical demonstration. Clark is not introduced as a conventional explorer looking for danger. His encounter with the impossible arrives during a period of personal instability, which means the new space carries emotional pressure before its larger meaning is clear. Mary, the therapist connected to his disappearance, brings a different kind of attention. She is trained to listen for patterns and concealed motives, yet the environment she enters does not offer the reassurance that patterns have interpretable causes. Their relationship gives the film a useful tension between psychological explanation and material threat. The reservation is that the movie's ideas are sometimes more vivid than its dramatic movement. The backrooms themselves create a powerful first impression, but repetition is built into the concept. A film centered on endless variation must keep proving that each variation changes the characters or the argument. At points, the architecture develops faster than the people moving through it. The images remain compelling, while the emotional logic can feel as though it is following behind, trying to attach personal meaning to spaces already strong enough to dominate the scene. That imbalance won't affect every viewer equally. Anyone drawn to liminal imagery, unresolved cosmology, environmental storytelling, or horror that works through sustained unease is likely to find a great deal to admire. Viewers who need clear rules, rapid answers, or a tightly escalating chain of conventional scares may experience the same ambiguity as distance. The film is less interested in reassuring us that every mystery has a key than in testing how long we continue searching after certainty has disappeared. So the first judgment is measured but positive. Backrooms succeeds most clearly when it trusts space, sound, and human hesitation to generate fear. It becomes less secure when it tries to convert an intentionally fragmentary nightmare into a complete emotional architecture. Even then, its weaknesses grow from the same ambition that makes it distinctive: the attempt to transform an internet-born sensation into a story about people whose inner disorientation begins to resemble the place around them. What keeps that story moving is not simply the desire to escape. It is the need to understand a disappearance and the dangerous belief that understanding the person may also explain the place. Clark begins the film with a problem that looks smaller than horror. His furniture business is losing its identity, his personal life has contracted, and the architectural ambition that once gave him direction has been reduced to selling versions of comfort designed by somebody else. The strange doorway beneath his showroom does not merely interrupt that decline. It appears to offer an answer to it. For the first time in a long while, Clark has found a space that no one around him can fully name, value, or control. That is the central want beneath the surface story. Clark may initially want to understand what lies beyond the opening, but the stronger desire is to recover a sense of authorship over his own life. As a former architect, he is trained to believe that space can be studied through proportion, sequence, and function. As a struggling store owner, he is surrounded by rooms whose purposes have already been decided. Bedrooms promise rest, dining sets promise family, office furniture promises productivity, the backrooms remove those assigned meanings. To Clark, that emptiness is frightening, but it is also seductive. It gives him something genuinely unknown in a life that has begun to feel painfully predetermined. The screenplay therefore makes curiosity and self-deception operate together. When Clark first crosses the threshold, he does not behave as though he has entered a supernatural legend. He tries to convert the place into a practical problem. He observes, measures, remembers turns, and searches for a pattern. These are sensible responses, which is why his deeper mistake does not immediately look like one. The film lets competence become the first stage of obsession. Every attempt to map the rooms strengthens his belief that the next attempt might succeed. The obstacle is not simply that the corridors are endless. The larger obstacle is that the backrooms answer observation with imitation rather than clarity. Their surfaces resemble offices, hallways, storage spaces, and transitional areas, but the connections between them do not behave consistently. Clark keeps receiving enough order to justify another experiment, never enough to establish control. The environment does not completely reject his intelligence, it feeds it partial results. That distinction creates the story's momentum. A totally chaotic space would force Clark to retreat or surrender. A space that occasionally appears logical keeps him engaged. A repeated wall pattern looks like evidence. A familiar room seems to confirm a route. A change in lighting suggests movement toward a boundary. Each possibility produces a new decision, and every decision carries him farther from the ordinary world he claims he is trying to return to. His choice to involve other people locks the story into consequence. What begins as a private discovery becomes a shared risk when Clark brings employees into the search. Their presence changes the moral shape of exploration. He is no longer testing only his own courage or judgment. He is using his authority, however casually, to make the impossible seem manageable to people who depend on him. The journey beneath the store becomes an extension of the workplace above it. Clark defines the task, others follow his lead, and uncertainty is treated as something confidence can overcome. The film is careful not to make that confidence purely heroic. Clark's excitement carries the energy of someone who believes he has finally found the thing that will prove he was never ordinary. His failure elsewhere gives the doorway disproportionate emotional value. Turning back would not feel like abandoning a dangerous location. It would feel like returning to the version of himself he wants to escape. This is why warnings do not function normally around him. Evidence of danger becomes evidence of importance. The cost of failure expands in stages. At first it is physical, disorientation, separation, and the possibility that the route home will disappear. Then it becomes social. Clark's insistence strains the already fragile trust between him and the people around him. Finally, it becomes psychological. The backrooms begin to offer a language through which he can reinterpret his disappointments. Instead of seeing his choices as part of his decline, he can imagine that ordinary reality was always the lesser world, and that this discovery has selected him for something larger. Mary enters that structure from the opposite direction. As Clark's therapist, she is trained to listen without automatically accepting the story being told. When he describes the place beneath the showroom, her task is not to solve its architecture, but to understand why he returns to it, what need the story satisfies, and where his perception may be breaking from shared reality. This gives their scenes a productive double pressure. The audience knows that Clark has encountered something materially impossible, while Mary has every professional reason to question the meaning he assigns to it. The film avoids making her skepticism foolish. The evidence may be real, yet Clark's interpretation of that evidence remains unstable. He has found an extraordinary place, but that does not mean every conclusion he draws from it is correct. Mary's attention keeps the narrative from becoming a simple conflict between belief and disbelief. She is not merely the rational person waiting to be proven wrong. She is trying to separate an external threat from the private need growing around it. That separation becomes harder as Clark withdraws from ordinary obligations. His sessions stop functioning as spaces of reflection and begin to resemble negotiations over who has the authority to define his experience. He wants Mary to confirm that the discovery has meaning. She wants him to recognize the damage caused by treating meaning as proof. Neither can fully reach the other because each conversation is shaped by information the other cannot inhabit. Clark has entered the backrooms. Mary has entered Clark's account of them. When he disappears, the screenplay transfers its engine to her. Mary's search is motivated by responsibility, concern, and a personal need to believe that careful attention can still reach someone who is pulling away. Following his trail into the labyrinth is therefore more than an act of rescue. It is the physical expression of the therapist's most dangerous hope, that entering another person's inner world deeply enough will reveal the path that brings them back. This is where the story's two movements join. Clark enters because the unknown seems to restore possibility. Mary enters because abandoning him would feel like accepting the limit of care. He is pulled by the promise that the space can remake him. She is pulled by the belief that understanding can save him. The Backrooms exploit both impulses without needing to announce a plan. The screenplay sustains suspense by changing the meaning of forward motion. For Clark, moving deeper initially feels like discovery. For Mary, the same movement feels like pursuit, yet both are gradually caught in a structure where purpose does not guarantee progress. A person can walk with absolute determination while becoming more lost. The architecture turns intention into a poor compass. That is also why the story can delay answers without becoming completely static. The rooms repeat, but the human stakes do not. Every return changes who is making the journey, why they continue, and what they are prepared to sacrifice. Clark's exploration becomes attachment. Mary's investigation becomes commitment. The apparent maze is constant. The pressure inside the travelers keeps escalating. By stopping short of a clear explanation, the film preserves the most important uncertainty for this stage of the analysis. The doorway may be an accident, an experiment, an intrusion, or part of a system operating beyond the character's knowledge. What matters first is that Clark and Mary do not encounter the same place emotionally. He sees an escape from a diminished identity. She sees a person disappearing behind a pattern he can no longer question. The story engine is therefore not the portal alone. It is the collision between an environment that cannot be reliably understood and two people who need understanding for different reasons. That collision keeps the film moving even when the corridors appear to lead nowhere. And it prepares the next question. When certainty disappears, what does pressure reveal about the person still choosing to move forward? Clark's visible goal is to prove that the impossible space beneath his store is real. His less visible need is more difficult to satisfy. He wants evidence that his life has not narrowed because of his own choices. If the Backrooms have singled him out, then failure can be reinterpreted as preparation. The failed architecture career, the broken marriage, the drinking, and the humiliating furniture advertisements no longer have to form a pattern of decline. They can become the ordinary chapter before an extraordinary discovery. That possibility explains why Clark responds to danger with renewed commitment. His training as an architect tells him that space should reveal intention. His disappointment tells him that finding that intention could restore his value. These two forces reinforce each other until investigation becomes personal validation. He is not only mapping a place. He is defending the version of himself who believes he was meant to build, interpret, and master spaces rather than sleep inside a staged bedroom on his showroom floor. Chiwetel Ejiofor gives that contradiction weight by refusing to separate Clark's intelligence from his bitterness. The character can be observant, persuasive, and genuinely vulnerable, then suddenly turn defensive when another person questions the meaning he has assigned to what he found. His volatility does not arrive as a completely different personality. It grows from the same wounded pride that makes his curiosity understandable. The performance is especially effective when Clark tries to present control rather than actually possessing it. He speaks about the discovery as though careful description can stabilize it, yet the effort behind that confidence remains visible. His authority feels constructed in real time, which makes every challenge to it seem dangerous. The Backrooms threaten his body, but disbelief threatens the identity he is attempting to recover. Clark's central fear is therefore not simply being trapped, he fears returning unchanged. Escape would preserve his life, but it would also send him back to the failed store, the separation, and the knowledge that the most important thing he ever discovered remains beyond his control. The film uses this fear to complicate the usual logic of survival. A rational person should leave an unsafe environment. Clark's emotional logic makes retreat feel like another form of disappearance. His blind spot is the belief that intense personal meaning must indicate external purpose. Because the backrooms make him feel selected, he begins to behave as though they have selected him. The distinction may sound small, but it governs nearly every damaging decision he makes. He confuses the depth of his response with the reliability of his interpretation. Mary exposes that blind spot because her work depends on maintaining the boundary between experience and explanation. She does not need to dismiss what Clark feels in order to question what he believes it proves. That distinction makes their relationship more interesting than a simple confrontation between skepticism and truth. Clark is correct that the place exists. Mary may still be correct that his growing attachment to it is destructive. Renate Reinsve plays Mary with a quieter form of instability. Her professional manner is gentle and attentive, but the calm never feels effortless. Mary listens as someone who has learned to control the emotional temperature of a room, partly because uncontrolled emotion carries its own history for her. The film connects that restraint to painful childhood memories, giving her empathy a personal cost rather than presenting it as an automatic virtue. Where Clark tries to force meaning onto the world, Mary tries to hold competing meanings open. Reinsve communicates that difference through hesitation and measured reaction. She often appears to be testing several possible responses before choosing one, as though every sentence must avoid pushing Clark farther away. This makes her silences active. She is not empty of judgment. She is deciding how much judgment the relationship can survive. Her visible goal is to help Clark regain stability. Beneath it lies a need to prove that careful attention can prevent another person from being lost. The profession gives her a structure for that hope. Listen closely, identify the pattern, and intervene before damage becomes irreversible. Yet the film gradually reveals the danger inside this ideal. Care can become a form of overresponsibility when another person's choices are treated as a problem that sufficient empathy should be able to solve. Clark and Mary therefore pressure each other at precisely the point where each feels most competent. Clark brings Mary an experience that resists psychological classification. Mary asks Clark to consider that discovering something real does not make his response healthy. He needs her recognition, but resents the conditions under which she can honestly give it. She needs to believe that reflection can still reach him, but his certainty turns reflection into an insult. Their sessions become miniature versions of the Backrooms. Both characters enter with a purpose, follow familiar procedures, and expect the space to produce progress. Instead, they circle the same unresolved need. Clark wants confirmation. Mary wants self-recognition. Each conversation opens another doorway without providing an exit. The opposing force is not located in one character or creature. It is the interaction between the environment and the stories the characters already tell themselves. The Backrooms do not need to invent Clark's resentment. They give it architecture. They do not create Mary's compulsion to save. They transform that compulsion into a path she can physically follow. The place becomes powerful by offering external form to internal pressure. That idea also changes how the supporting characters function. Bobby and Kat initially provide practical resistance to Clark's obsession. They are employees rather than fellow believers, so their willingness to follow him carries an imbalance of authority. Clark may frame the exploration as shared curiosity, but he is the person who controls their work and defines the seriousness of the discovery. Finn Bennett gives Bobby an immediacy that contrasts with Clark's need to theorize. His presence helps turn abstract danger into a workplace decision made by a young person responding to an older man's confidence. Lukita Maxwell's Cat brings another valuable response, alertness without Clark's emotional investment. Both characters make the risk legible because they have less need for the Backrooms to mean something. The limitation is that the film uses them more effectively as pressure points than as fully developed people. They create consequences, expose Clark's authority, and give the exploration a human scale, but their interior lives remain comparatively thin. This weakens part of the moral pressure. The film wants Clark's decisions to feel costly, yet it does not always give Bobby and Kat enough independent definition for that cost to land with its full weight. Still, their relative normality serves an important dramatic function. Clark sees the doorway as a possible restoration of identity. They see a dangerous discovery in the basement of a failing job. That gap reveals how much of Clark's enthusiasm depends on his private history. The same rooms do not promise everyone the same thing. The pressure map finally divides the characters not by courage, but by the story each needs the backrooms to confirm. Clark needs the place to prove that his life contains hidden significance. Mary needs the search to prove that no one is beyond the reach of understanding. Bobby and Kat need only to survive the consequences of believing a man who has stopped recognizing the limits of his responsibility. This is where the film's character argument becomes most persuasive. Pressure does not transform these people into strangers. It concentrates what was already present. Clark's curiosity becomes possession, Mary's care becomes obligation, professional authority becomes moral risk. The backrooms do not erase identity. They repeat it, distort it, and build corridors from the parts each person would rather describe as virtues. That pattern points toward the deeper thread beneath the horror. The labyrinth may look like an escape from ordinary life, but it behaves more like a machine for trapping people inside the explanations they have already chosen. On the surface, Backrooms is about people entering a place that should not exist and trying to survive its shifting geography. Beneath that premise, the film is more interested in a quieter form of entrapment, the moment a person mistakes familiarity for understanding. The rooms look close enough to ordinary life that the mind keeps trying to complete them. A corridor suggests a destination. A doorway suggests a meaningful division. A furnished area suggests someone once chose how that space should be used. The film repeatedly offers those signals, then removes the human logic that would make them reliable. This creates a different kind of fear from complete alienness. Something entirely unfamiliar can be rejected as unknown. The backrooms resist that rejection because they resemble places the characters already know how to read. They use the visual language of offices, showrooms, waiting areas, service corridors, and unfinished interiors. These are not usually places where people form deep emotional attachments. They are temporary environments designed to move us between more important destinations. By extending that temporary condition without limit, the film turns transition into a permanent state. That idea connects the architecture directly to Clark. Before discovering the doorway, he is already living between identities. He was trained to design spaces, but now sells arrangements designed by others. He is separated from the life he expected to have, yet has not built a convincing replacement. Even the showroom around him represents a strange form of suspended existence. It displays bedrooms where no one truly sleeps, dining rooms where no family gathers, and offices where no lasting work is completed. These staged environments imitate life without containing it. The backrooms enlarge that condition until it becomes impossible to ignore. They are not the opposite of Clark's ordinary world, they are its logic stripped of commercial polish. Both spaces are filled with arrangements that promise purpose. Both can make repetition look like choice. Both allow a person to move continuously without necessarily arriving anywhere new. The supernatural dimension frightens Clark, but it also reflects the life he has been avoiding above it. This is why the film's treatment of familiarity matters more than simple visual recognition. Familiarity lowers resistance. It encourages the belief that the next room can be interpreted using the rules of the previous one. That belief is useful in ordinary life because built environments usually contain consistent intentions. A staircase connects levels. An exit sign indicates a route outward. A waiting room belongs to a larger institution. Inside the backrooms, these expectations continue operating after their guarantee has vanished. The danger is not that the characters become irrational. It is that their reasoning remains rational for too long within an irrational structure. They continue forming hypotheses, testing routes, and assigning significance to changes in design. The film does not mock that impulse. It understands that interpretation is one of the mind's basic survival tools. Without patterns, experience becomes overwhelming. Yet a pattern can also become a trap when the need to find it grows stronger than the evidence supporting it. Clark embodies that risk through control. Architecture once offered him a way to transform imagination into physical order. A design begins as possibility, then becomes a structure that directs how people move, gather, rest, and see. The backrooms reverse that relationship. Clark enters as an observer looking for design, but the environment begins directing him before he understands what it is directing him toward. He believes he is reading the space while the space is shaping his choices. Mary approaches the same problem through memory and responsibility. Her professional identity depends on the possibility that a person's behavior can become more legible when placed inside the right emotional context. Contradictions may point toward fear, repetition may reveal avoidance, silence may contain information that speech cannot safely express. This method has value because human behavior is not random, even when its causes are hidden. The backrooms imitate the surface of that interpretive process. They repeat, withhold, and rearrange. They seem to invite the kind of patient attention Mary has trained herself to offer, yet they provide no assurance that their patterns arise from a coherent psychology. The environment can resemble a mind without being one. It can appear wounded, defensive, or deliberately misleading because those are the categories Mary brings to it. Her strength becomes vulnerable to the same distortion as Clark's. Both assume that persistent observation should eventually produce meaning. Control, memory, and responsibility therefore form the deeper structure beneath the horror. Clark wants control over a life that has become smaller than his ambitions. Mary carries the responsibility of someone who believes attention creates an obligation to act. Memory shapes both of them by determining what each person recognizes inside the maze. They do not see neutral rooms. They see possibilities organized by their previous failures. The recurring importance of thresholds gives these ideas a physical form. A doorway is usually a minor decision. Crossing it changes the room, not the rules of reality. Here, every threshold carries the possibility that the previous space cannot be recovered. The simple act of stepping forward becomes morally and psychologically loaded. A character must decide whether new information is worth the risk of losing the old position. Clark treats thresholds as invitations. Each one suggests that the next area may contain the explanation missing from the last. Mary experiences them more cautiously, but her reason for continuing is equally personal. Turning back would mean accepting that care has a limit, that another person can move beyond the point where understanding is enough. Neither character is forced forward by curiosity alone. They are pushed by what retreat would require them to admit. The film also uses spatial distance to question emotional closeness. Clark wants Mary to understand him, yet the more urgently he demands that understanding, the harder genuine communication becomes. Mary follows his experience more deeply, but physical proximity to his path does not automatically bring her closer to his interpretation. The maze exposes a painful truth about empathy. Entering another person's perspective does not guarantee that the two of you will reach the same conclusion. That tension prevents the movie from reducing the backrooms to a simple metaphor for mental illness, grief, or professional failure. The environment is materially dangerous within the story. Clark's experience is not unreal merely because it also reflects his emotional condition. The stronger reading holds both levels together. A real place can become meaningful through the fears brought into it, just as a real threat can be misunderstood by someone who needs it to confirm a private story. One way to read the film is that the labyrinth punishes people for trying to control it. Another is that it does not punish anyone at all. It may simply exist, indifferent to the meanings projected onto it. That second possibility is more unsettling because it removes the comfort of moral design. If the rooms are not teaching a lesson, testing a character, or selecting a victim, then suffering inside them cannot be converted into a purposeful narrative. The film remains productively uncertain on this point. It gives the architecture enough responsiveness to feel almost intentional, but not enough to prove that intention. A repeated shape may be communication or mechanical recurrence. An apparent route may be bait or coincidence. The characters cannot stop asking which interpretation is correct because their survival appears to depend on the answer. Our own viewing follows the same pattern. We search the frame for anomalies, treat repeated details as clues, and assume that careful attention will be rewarded with comprehension. The film makes us participants in the character's mistake. We want the maze to possess a hidden system because a hidden system is less frightening than the absence of one. This brings the deep view question into sharper focus. Familiarity becomes dangerous not because ordinary rooms are secretly evil, but because recognizable forms encourage trust after trust is no longer justified. The characters keep extending human logic into a space that may only imitate its appearance. Their intelligence remains active. Their experience remains real. What fails is the assumption that reality owes them an explanation shaped for the human mind. The deeper threat of Backrooms is therefore not simply that people can become lost inside architecture. It is that they can become trapped inside interpretation. Clark believes the right pattern will restore control. Mary believes the right understanding will preserve responsibility. The maze keeps both beliefs alive just long enough to draw them forward. To test whether that idea is truly built into the film rather than imposed upon it, we need to narrow our attention. The argument becomes clearest when individual scenes show space, sound, performance, and withheld information working together. Clark's first passage through the showroom wall establishes the film's method with unusual efficiency. The scene begins inside a commercial environment designed to eliminate uncertainty. Furniture is grouped into complete domestic arrangements, aisles guide customers between displays, and every object can be understood through price, function, and placement. Clark may be sleeping inside this artificial world, but visually it still obeys the rules of a store. The opening beneath that space violates those rules without immediately replacing them with spectacle. Clark does not step through a grand portal surrounded by dramatic energy. The boundary appears unstable, and the transition feels closer to a failure in the image than the opening of a conventional doorway. The ordinary surface seems to stop enforcing its own solidity. That restraint matters because the impossible arrives through something Clark has probably passed many times without examining. Once he crosses, the camera allows the new environment to reveal itself through duration. The faded walls, aging carpet, and fluorescent ceiling are visible enough to be assessed, but the frame contains no obvious center of importance. There is no landmark telling Clark or the audience where to look. The eye begins searching the edges, the openings, and the distances between partitions. Empty space becomes active because any section of it might contain the detail that explains the rest. The sound creates a second enclosure around him. The electrical hum is not merely background atmosphere. It gives the rooms a constant physical pressure, filling the silence without providing the comfort of human activity. Ordinary interiors contain small changes in sound that help measure distance. Voices through a wall, traffic outside, machinery from another floor. Here, the persistent tone seems to flatten those distinctions. A corridor 20 feet away and a corridor far beyond it can feel equally close. Clark's performance initially resists panic. He studies the surfaces, tests his position, and keeps converting unease into observation. That reaction places the audience beside his reasoning rather than above it. The scene does not ask us to laugh at the man who goes farther than he should. It shows why a former architect might experience fear and fascination at the same time. The more the room refuses explanation, the more valuable explanation becomes. The scene therefore changes the viewer's position gradually. At first, we watch Clark discover an impossible place. Soon, we begin participating in his attempt to organize it. We inspect repeated forms and compare one opening with another. The sequence quietly trains us to make the same assumption that later traps him. If the environment contains patterns, those patterns must eventually become readable. A therapy session tests that assumption through performance rather than architecture. Mary asks Clark to work through the collapse of his marriage by reenacting a painful domestic confrontation. The staging is controlled and almost plain. Two people occupy a professional room where speech is supposed to turn emotional confusion into something that can be examined. Unlike the Backrooms, this space has a recognized purpose, clear boundaries, and an established guide. Yet the role-playing exercise makes those boundaries unstable. Mary temporarily occupies a position associated with Clark's former wife, while Clark must speak into a past situation as though it can be reconstructed in the present. The scene does not recreate the marriage objectively. It reveals Clark's version of it, shaped by resentment, shame, and the need to explain himself. The missing person in the room becomes as influential as either visible character. Ejiofor's timing exposes how quickly reflection can become defense. Clark begins with enough cooperation to suggest that he wants the exercise to work. As emotional pressure increases, his speech becomes less exploratory and more controlling. He is no longer discovering what he feels. He is trying to establish which interpretation Mary is allowed to accept. Reinsve responds by making stillness feel like effort. Mary listens, pauses, and chooses when to intervene, but her professional calm does not remove her from the conflict. The scene's tension comes from watching her decide whether maintaining the exercise is helping Clark or giving his anger a safer stage. Her restraint encourages him to continue, while also making every small reaction visible. This session functions as a human version of the labyrinth. Clark follows a familiar route into memory, expecting it to confirm where responsibility belongs. Mary keeps opening alternative paths, asking him to consider consequences he would rather classify as misunderstandings. The closer they approach the emotional center, the more aggressively Clark tries to redirect the route. The scene deepens the guiding question because familiarity is again doing dangerous work. The recognizable structure of therapy gives Clark confidence that his account can be translated into a clear conclusion. He treats the exercise as another map. When the route does not lead where he expects, he challenges the person guiding him rather than the assumptions he carried into the room. The expedition with Kat and Bobby combines these two forms of pressure. Clark returns to the backrooms with people and a video camera, attempting to transform private experience into recordable evidence. The camera should make the place more trustworthy. It promises a stable point of view, a sequence that can be reviewed, and proof that does not depend entirely on Clark's account. Instead, recording makes the space feel less secure. The handheld image narrows perception. Whoever holds the camera can document only one direction, while the architecture continues beyond the frame. Turning to inspect one opening means losing sight of another. The format creates evidence and vulnerability at the same time. The blocking also reveals Clark's authority. He moves as the person who believes he understands the environment best, while Kat and Bobby respond to instructions, distances, and changes they cannot independently evaluate. Their bodies provide a scale that the empty rooms previously lacked. Once several people occupy the frame, the architecture seems larger, not smaller. Human presence demonstrates how little of the environment can be controlled at once. Clark's attention remains divided between exploration and presentation. He wants the recording to validate what he found, so observation becomes performance. His confidence must reassure the others and the future viewer of the tape. That need makes hesitation more difficult. Turning back would not simply end the expedition, it would weaken the proof he has brought them there to create. The editing uses separation as a threat before any explicit danger is required. A cut, a turn, or a change in camera position can make the group's arrangement suddenly uncertain. The viewer begins tracking not only the rooms but the distance between people. Space becomes frightening through its ability to interrupt responsibility. Clark may bring others inside, but he cannot guarantee that he can keep them together. These scenes test the deep view question from three angles. The first entry shows familiarity inviting interpretation. The therapy session shows familiar emotional narratives resisting correction. The recorded expedition shows familiar technology promising control it cannot deliver. In each case, a recognizable system appears to protect the characters: architecture, therapy, documentation. In each case, that system remains useful only until the characters trust it beyond its limits. The scenes are not powerful because the backrooms constantly reveal something new. They are powerful because the film changes what an ordinary tool can guarantee. A doorway cannot guarantee connection. A conversation cannot guarantee understanding. A camera cannot guarantee knowledge. Once those promises weaken, the characters are left with the habits that brought them forward and no certainty that those habits can lead them back. The most important craft decision in Backrooms is that the film does not treat the labyrinth as a location waiting to be photographed. Direction, production design, cinematography, editing, and sound collaborate to make it behave like an unstable way of seeing. The rooms rarely change through one obvious effect. Their threat emerges through the relationship between what the frame shows, what the soundtrack implies, and what the characters cannot verify. Kane Parsons' direction begins with brightness. Conventional horror often reduces visibility so that darkness can conceal danger. The backrooms are frequently exposed beneath flat fluorescent light. Walls, carpet, ceiling panels, and distant openings remain available for inspection. That visibility should create confidence, yet it produces the opposite response because the image contains more space than the viewer can process with certainty. The frames repeatedly encourage searching without identifying a secure object of attention. A doorway may sit deep in the composition, while an empty partition occupies the foreground. A corridor may extend far enough to suggest scale, but not far enough to reveal its destination. Human figures appear small against repeating surfaces, giving the architecture visual authority without requiring exaggerated camera angles. Cinematography shifts between composed, dramatic coverage and the narrower uncertainty of recorded footage. In the controlled images, distance allows us to study the relationship between bodies and rooms. In the handheld passages, the camera becomes a vulnerable participant. It can turn, retreat, and react, but it cannot observe everything simultaneously. Each mode creates a different fear. The wide frame suggests that danger could already be visible, while the recorded frame suggests that crucial information may exist just beyond its edge. This contrast prevents the found footage language from becoming a decorative reference to Parsons' online work. The image format changes the viewer's responsibility. A stable shot invites examination. A moving camera forces selection. When the lens turns toward one opening, the audience becomes newly conscious of the space abandoned behind it. The film makes looking feel like a decision with consequences. Production design gives that cinematography something unusually difficult to photograph: repetition that remains visually specific. Parsons has confirmed that approximately 30,000 square feet of sets were constructed on a soundstage, and that he planned the feature through extensive digital shot design in Blender. Those choices help explain why the rooms feel traversable rather than like a handful of walls rearranged between shots. The camera can move through depth, turn corners, and allow bodies to occupy the environment with physical weight. The scale also supports controlled variation. The film does not need every area to appear radically different. A change in ceiling height, wall texture, furniture placement, or corridor width can alter the emotional pressure while preserving the sense that every room belongs to the same impossible system. Similarity provides continuity, small deviations create suspicion. That balance is crucial. If each doorway revealed a completely new fantasy environment, the film would become a tour of visual invention. Instead, the design often makes change difficult to measure. The viewer has to decide whether a space is truly new, slightly altered, or disturbingly familiar. Production design becomes part of the mystery because recognition never guarantees orientation. The color palette works through the same principle. The faded yellow and beige surfaces are unpleasant without appearing aggressively stylized. These tones recall aging commercial interiors, neglected offices, and places built to be functional rather than memorable. The lack of dramatic color makes every interruption more noticeable. A darker opening, a colder area, or an object that does not belong can redirect the entire frame. Editing controls when those differences become legible. The film often lets a shot continue long enough for the audience to perform its own search. Cutting too rapidly would transform uncertainty into simple confusion. Holding indefinitely would allow the image to become predictable. The rhythm usually occupies the uncomfortable interval between those extremes, giving us time to establish a possible map before movement or a cut makes that map unreliable. The transitions between Clark's ordinary world and the labyrinth also create a structural echo. The showroom above ground is divided into artificial domestic spaces, while the backrooms repeat environments whose functions remain uncertain. Editing can move between these worlds without presenting them as complete opposites. The continuity of shapes, surfaces, and staged interiors suggests that Clark does not leave familiarity behind when he crosses the boundary. He enters a distorted extension of it. Sound provides the pressure that the bright image refuses to supply through darkness. The fluorescent hum establishes a constant presence, but the soundscape does not remain perfectly uniform. Faint changes in resonance, distant movement, and noises without visible sources make the rooms feel larger than the frame. Because the environment already produces continuous noise, the audience must decide whether each variation matters. Silence is used selectively rather than as the default sign of danger. When the electrical layer thins or disappears, the absence feels physical. The viewer has adjusted to the hum as an unpleasant form of stability, so removing it can be more alarming than increasing the volume. The film turns an irritating background sound into a temporary measure of safety. The score by Parsons and Edo van Bremen avoids functioning only as an alarm system. Its ambient and distorted textures sometimes merge with the environment closely enough that music and room tone become difficult to separate. That uncertainty suits a film in which characters cannot always distinguish an external signal from a meaning created by their own attention. Visual effects complete the convergence most effectively when they remain subordinate to physical space. The film's impossible transitions and environmental disturbances work because the surrounding rooms possess believable texture, scale, and light. An effect does not need to dominate the screen. It only has to break one trusted rule inside an otherwise tangible image. The creature and anomaly work follows a related restraint. Their impact depends less on prolonged display than on the uncertainty of distance, shape, and movement. The film generally understands that complete visibility would turn a troubling presence into an object that could be studied. Partial information preserves the more important fear, not knowing whether the viewer has correctly identified what entered the frame. These craft systems converge around a single experience. Design offers recognizable structure. Cinematography invites examination. Editing permits temporary conclusions. Sound destabilizes those conclusions, and effects interrupt the physical rules that made them possible. No department has to announce that the space is impossible because each one quietly removes a different guarantee. The result supports the film's argument rather than merely decorating it. The backrooms are frightening because every technical element gives us enough information to keep interpreting, then withholds the certainty that interpretation normally earns. The craft does not simply place characters inside a maze. It teaches the audience to trust the maze's visual language, then makes that trust increasingly difficult to defend. The most consequential weakness in Backrooms is not that it refuses to explain its dimension. The larger problem is that the film sometimes asks its human drama to carry meanings the characters have not been given enough time to earn. Clark and Mary are built around compelling contradictions, but parts of their emotional histories function more like interpretive keys than fully lived experiences. The film tells us which wounds shape them, then occasionally moves too quickly from those wounds to the symbolic forms waiting inside the labyrinth. Clark is strongest when his obsession develops through behavior. His damaged pride, professional disappointment, and hunger for control are visible in the way he recruits others, rejects caution, and converts each failed attempt into justification for another. The character becomes less persuasive when the film presses too firmly on the idea that the backrooms are an external image of his collapsed identity. The metaphor is already present in the furniture showroom, the false domestic displays, and the endless spaces without stable purpose. Repeating the emotional connection more directly can reduce the productive uncertainty. Mary faces a similar difficulty. Her history explains why she cannot easily abandon a patient who appears to be disappearing beyond her reach. That motivation gives her search emotional logic, yet the screenplay occasionally treats her past as a shortcut to inevitability. Concern becomes commitment, and commitment becomes dissent, without every stage receiving the resistance it needs. Her decision remains understandable, but understanding the decision is not identical to feeling that no other choice was possible. This matters because the film's architecture is exceptionally persuasive. The rooms possess texture, scale, and an unsettling internal rhythm. When the environment feels more psychologically complete than the people inside it, character scenes can begin to resemble bridges between visual set pieces. Ejiofor and Reinsve resist that problem through performance. Their pauses, defensive shifts, and controlled reactions suggest more complexity than the screenplay always states. Even so, strong acting cannot fully replace dramatic development. The weakness affects pacing as well. Repetition is essential to the Backrooms concept, but repetition needs escalation in meaning, not only variation in space. Several passages sustain atmosphere without substantially changing the relationship between the characters, the environment, or the audience's understanding of the risk. The tension remains present, yet the story occasionally pauses at the same emotional level while the rooms continue changing around it. A smaller limitation comes from the distribution of threat. The film is often more frightening when almost nothing happens than when it presents a clearly designed anomaly or creature. Empty distance encourages the audience to imagine several possibilities at once. A visible threat narrows those possibilities into one object with a shape, location, and behavior. Some later horror images are conceptually connected to the characters, but the connection can make them easier to interpret and therefore less disturbing. That is not an argument that the film should remain empty for its entire running time. A feature needs changes in intensity, and a story about people entering a dangerous dimension eventually has to demonstrate consequence. The issue is one of proportion. The film's most distinctive fear comes from spaces that cannot be confidently read. Whenever a threat becomes too legible, the movie briefly exchanges its strongest form of horror for a more familiar one. The fairest defense is that these limitations come from deliberate choices rather than simple carelessness. Parsons is trying to combine two forms that naturally resist each other. Liminal horror gains power from incompleteness, fragmented evidence, and the absence of a stable emotional guide. A character-driven feature needs development, causality, and decisions whose consequences accumulate. Strengthening one side can weaken the other. More detailed explanations of the Backrooms might have improved narrative clarity while reducing their mystery. More conventional character arcs might have made the emotional beats smoother while turning the dimension into a transparent metaphor. More frequent threats might have accelerated the pace while exhausting the film's atmosphere. The movie's unevenness is partly the cost of refusing those easier solutions. The same defense applies to its ambiguity. Viewers who see the lack of firm rules as missing information have a reasonable complaint. A film can withhold answers while still establishing boundaries that make decisions feel strategically meaningful. Backrooms sometimes leaves the characters and audience without enough knowledge to judge why one choice should be more dangerous than another. When every route is unknowable, suspense can lose some precision because prediction becomes impossible. Yet complete rules would contradict the film's central idea. The characters are endangered by extending familiar logic into an environment that does not guarantee it. A clean set of mechanics would restore exactly the confidence the movie wants to remove. The absence of explanation is therefore not the flaw. The flaw appears when uncertainty stops generating interpretation and begins generating distance. That distinction determines the judgment. The character compression is consequential because it limits how deeply several losses and decisions can land. The uneven escalation is tolerable because the atmosphere remains unusually controlled and the film's best sequences justify its patience. Neither problem destroys the movie. Both prevent its visual and sonic imagination from becoming an equally complete emotional experience. Backrooms is most distinctive because it preserves the discomfort of an internet-born nightmare instead of converting it into a fully domesticated studio mythology. Its friction comes from the attempt to give that nightmare a human center without explaining away its emptiness. The attempt does not always hold together, but the cracks are inseparable from the ambition. The question now is where this film sits within the wider history of liminal horror, found footage, and stories built from collective digital folklore. The wider history of Backrooms begins with authorship that is unusually difficult to locate. The central image and premise emerged online in 2019 through an anonymous post. A sickly yellow interior, a description of slipping outside ordinary reality, and the suggestion of an endless maze with no guaranteed purpose. Because the idea did not arrive as a finished story owned by a single visible storyteller, it developed like digital folklore. Different users added creatures, levels, rules, games, and explanations, often contradicting one another while still contributing to the same broad mythology. Kane Parsons entered that mythology without trying to organize every version into one official canon. His 2022 short used found footage language to make the space feel accidentally documented. The rough recording, limited perspective, and apparent lack of conventional authorship suggested that the viewer had discovered evidence rather than received a polished narrative. This placed his work beside a horror tradition in which the camera is not simply a window onto danger. It is an object carried by someone whose knowledge is incomplete. The comparison to the Blair Witch Project is useful up to a point. Both understand that imperfect footage can make fiction feel less protected by cinematic convention. A frame may miss the important event. The person holding the camera may misunderstand what is happening. Yet Backrooms belongs to a different media environment. Its mystery grew through online repetition, reaction videos, fan theories, digital environments, and collective attempts to expand a fragment. That origin changes the challenge of the feature film. Most adaptations move from a relatively stable source toward a new interpretation. Backrooms moves from a shared and unstable imaginative space toward a single dramatic structure. The film must be specific enough to support Clark and Mary while remaining open enough that the maze does not feel permanently defined. Every explanation risks shrinking a concept whose power came partly from having no final authority. The movie's relationship to analog horror is similarly selective. It borrows degraded recording, institutional imagery, incomplete documentation, and the anxiety of obsolete media. These devices suggest that something has been captured without being understood. But the feature does not remain inside archival imitation. Its dramatic scenes give the audience emotional access that Parsons' shorter work could often withhold. The transition from anonymous-looking evidence to recognizable actors changes the question from what this place is to what it does to a person who already needs it to mean something. Liminal space horror provides the larger cultural frame. Empty offices, abandoned malls, quiet schools, hotel corridors, and artificial domestic displays are unsettling because they appear between their intended uses. They retain evidence of social purpose while removing the people who complete it. Online culture turned that sensation into a recognizable visual category. Backrooms turns the category into narrative pressure by making the in-between condition physically inescapable. The film also arrives during a period when online creators are moving more visibly into feature filmmaking. That matters less as a story of youthful success than as evidence of a changing route into cinema. Parsons developed visual language, technical methods, and an audience before entering a conventional production system. The feature tests whether a form shaped by pausing, replaying, theorizing, and fragmented release can survive the forward movement of theatrical storytelling. Critical responses have divided along that fault line. Supportive readings have emphasized the film's visual control, performances, and ability to preserve unease at feature length. More skeptical responses have argued that the human story cannot match the strength of the concept, and that repetition produces diminishing returns. Both reactions identify the same tension. The movie succeeds when incompleteness feels deliberate and weakens when it feels like missing dramatic substance. That disagreement prevents the film from being treated only as a successful transfer of internet culture into cinemas. Its importance lies in the compromise it attempts. It asks communal digital folklore to support authored character drama without losing the uncertainty that made the folklore compelling. The result is uneven, but the unevenness marks a real boundary between two storytelling systems. Seen within that wider frame, Clark's furniture showroom becomes more than a convenient entrance. It connects an anonymous internet image, found evidence, transitional architecture, and a feature film character trapped between former ambition and present failure. The film's larger context returns us to its most specific choice. The backrooms remain powerful because they are recognizable enough to inherit meanings from the world outside, even when they refuse to preserve those meanings. The most revealing production fact behind Backrooms is its physical scale. Kane Parsons has said that the production constructed roughly 30,000 square feet of backrooms sets across soundstages in Vancouver. That decision matters because the film's spaces are not merely digital backgrounds placed behind performers. The actors can turn corners, cross long distances, and disappear behind real partitions. Their bodies carry weight against the architecture, and the camera can discover depth through movement rather than simulate it entirely after the fact. Parsons designed those sets in Blender before they were built, describing the finished environments as close to one-for-one translations of his digital models. He and the production team also used Blender to plan the shots, effectively previsualizing the feature in advance. This explains the film's unusually controlled relationship between construction and framing. Walls do not appear only to fill a stage. Their positions determine when a figure becomes visible, how long a corridor can remain unreadable, and which empty section of the frame attracts suspicion. The design and camera strategy were developed as one system rather than two departments solving separate problems. That control also helps explain why the movie's repetition feels intentional even when it risks testing the viewer's patience. Parsons has described small changes in objects, switches, pillars, and spatial arrangements as narratively meaningful rather than accidental. He built his online work for viewers who pause, compare, and analyze, and he carried that expectation into the feature. A nearly repeated room is therefore not simply economical reuse. It asks the audience to measure difference while knowing that the film may be measuring their attention in return. Before the full production, Parsons completed a lane test shoot in Vancouver with a small crew. That step gave the project a practical bridge between a largely solo digital workflow and a large collaborative set. It also suggests why the feature preserves so much of his visual grammar despite the change in scale. The production did not begin by replacing his process, but by testing how that process could expand through other departments. The production was also designed to move beyond the limits of Parsons' original found footage format. He has explained that the short films reflected what he could make largely by himself, while the feature gave him the resources to focus on faces, performances, and the characters lives outside the maze. That intention sharpens the film's central experiment. The Backrooms remain visually close to the earlier concept, but Clark and Mary are meant to give the environment emotional context. The maze changes less than the person looking at it. That ambition clarifies both the achievement and the limitation of the finished film. The physical sets and detailed previsualization make the architecture feel coherent enough to resist explanation. The performance-centered expansion gives the feature a reason to exist beyond recreating a viral image on a larger screen. Yet the production evidence also reveals the imbalance identified earlier. Parsons' spatial system was developed with extraordinary precision, while the human drama sometimes feels like the newer structure being fitted inside it. These receipts strengthen the reading that Backrooms is a film about control, confronting something that cannot finally be controlled. Parsons planned the sets, shots, and variations in exacting detail so that the audience could experience uncertainty with precision. The apparent paradox is the point. Enormous preparation was required to create a world that feels as though preparation has stopped being useful. The remaining question is whether that design truly supports the psychological interpretation we have followed, or whether the film works better when the maze is allowed to mean much less. The strongest counterreading begins by refusing the idea that the Backrooms are meaningfully shaped around Clark and Mary. The labyrinth may resemble their failures, memories, and habits of interpretation, but resemblance is not proof of response. A person entering an unknowable environment will naturally organize it through whatever emotional language is available. Clark sees a structure to master because design once defined his value. Mary sees a pattern to understand because interpretation defines her work. The rooms may not be revealing either character. The characters may simply be revealing themselves while the rooms remain indifferent. From this angle, familiarity is not an active trap. It is the condition that allows the characters and audience to perceive the space as disturbing. A completely abstract dimension would offer no scale for wrongness. Yellow walls, fluorescent panels, carpet, doors, and office-like partitions provide comparison points. We recognize what these elements normally do, then feel the discomfort created by their useless arrangement. The effect does not require the environment to imitate memory or lure anyone with personalized meaning. It requires only recognizable materials and missing purpose. That distinction alters Clark's role. Our earlier reading treats him as someone seduced by a place reflecting his need for control. The alternative is harsher and more ordinary. Clark is not chosen, mirrored, or psychologically targeted. He encounters a genuine anomaly and uses it to avoid responsibilities he was already neglecting. The Backrooms do not turn curiosity into obsession. They provide a new object for an obsession that could have attached itself elsewhere. This interpretation makes his tragedy less cosmic. Clark wants his discovery to transform failure into destiny, but no external revelation can perform that repair. The doorway is extraordinary. His pattern of evasion is not. He continues to make choices, pressure other people, and reinterpret consequences in ways that protect his self-image. The maze needs no agency to become destructive when a person brings destructive habits into it. Mary can be read with the same restraint. Her decision to follow Clark does not have to mean that the labyrinth has found another vulnerability to exploit. It may reflect an ethical mistake within an otherwise admirable commitment. She extends professional concern beyond the point where she can act safely or effectively. Her history gives that choice emotional force, but the environment remains only the location where the cost becomes physical. This reading explains why the film preserves emotional distance. If the Backrooms were a precise externalization of two inner lives, the character connections might need to be more explicit and the spatial echoes more exact. Their incompleteness may be intentional. The rooms collect associations without resolving into a single metaphor. They can suggest burnout, institutional decay, memory, digital repetition, failed domesticity, or meaningless systems because none of those readings completely possesses them. Parsons' description of the feature supports this uncertainty. He has said that the characters' interior lives were meant to imply deeper meaning within the space rather than alter the mythology or provide a definitive explanation. Character does not necessarily decode architecture. It changes the emotional pressure under which architecture is observed. The counterreading also identifies a risk in our original argument. By calling the maze a machine that traps people inside their chosen explanations, we may be granting it the coherent function the film refuses to confirm. We turn uncertainty into a lesson about uncertainty. That is satisfying, but satisfaction can become another form of control. The Backrooms may be most effective when they do not complete an argument, reward attention, or arrange suffering into meaningful design. Still, the indifferent space reading leaves something unresolved. It explains the horror's openness, but not how carefully the film links character needs to ways of moving through the labyrinth. Clark does not merely become lost. He treats uncertainty as a challenge to his authority. Mary does not merely pursue him. She experiences retreat as moral failure. Those choices are too closely aligned with their inner lives to seem incidental. My position sits between the two readings. The Backrooms do not need a human intention to select visitors or to manufacture personalized trials. Their indifference may be essential. Yet the film uses that neutral impossibility as a pressure surface. It reflects nothing on its own, but it allows each person to project a pattern, then forces that person to live inside the consequences of believing it. The labyrinth may not be speaking to Clark or Mary. The more unsettling possibility is that they continue answering it anyway. On a first viewing, the Backrooms seem repetitive because the characters are trying to distinguish one section from another. On a second viewing, repetition becomes the evidence. A corridor that appears to return unchanged may carry slightly different spacing, an object shifted from its earlier position, or a structural element that no longer aligns with the route we thought we understood. The film does not always announce these variations. It trains the eye to treat similarity as camouflage. The most useful rewatch habit is therefore not searching for a hidden symbol in every frame. It is comparing relationships. Where does a pillar sit in relation to a doorway? How far is a switch from the corner? Does a passage open at the same angle as before? Parsons has confirmed that movements of objects, switches, and architectural elements were treated as narrative decisions rather than casual continuity changes. He described the film as something designed to be paused and analyzed, making apparent repetition capable of containing movement even when no character sees it happen. This gives Clark's early mapping attempts a different meaning. The first time through, his measurements and remembered turns look like reasonable efforts that fail because the place is too large. On a rewatch, the quieter possibility becomes more visible. The map may be accurate to a version of the environment that no longer exists. His confidence is not undermined only by human error. The space may be altering the conditions after he records them. The showroom above the entrance also deserves closer attention. Its staged bedrooms, offices, and dining areas initially establish Clark's failing business and diminished life. Later, their artificial domesticity begins to resemble a small, commercially acceptable version of the same logic below. Both environments reproduce the appearance of lived space without the continuity of actual living. Rewatching the early scenes with that parallel in mind makes the doorway feel less like an interruption and more like an escalation. Sound carries another pattern. The fluorescent hum seems constant enough to disappear into the background, but its small changes affect how the rooms are perceived. A shift in resonance can imply a larger chamber before the image confirms it. A thinning of the electrical layer can make an apparently unchanged corridor feel newly exposed. The sound does not merely accompany spatial instability. It becomes one of the few imperfect instruments available for measuring it. Clark's performance contains a more human signal. Early on, he often pauses before presenting a conclusion, as though observation is still producing thought. As his attachment grows, the pause changes function. It becomes the moment in which doubt is suppressed before certainty is performed. The words may still sound analytical, but the timing increasingly reveals that the conclusion arrived before the evidence. Mary's listening undergoes the opposite shift. In the therapy room, her silence creates room for Clark to reconsider what he is saying. Once the search becomes personal, similar stillness begins to suggest that she is carrying too many interpretations at once. The same controlled attention that appears professional early in the film later looks vulnerable to fixation. Reinsve does not need to announce that change. It accumulates in how long Mary watches before acting. The camera carried into the maze is another ordinary setup whose meaning grows. At first, recording seems like the obvious solution to an unbelievable discovery. It can preserve a route, prove what happened, and allow the journey to be reviewed. Yet footage is only as reliable as its frame. Every turn documents one direction while abandoning another, and every image preserves surfaces without guaranteeing that their arrangement will remain stable. The device produces evidence, but not authority. These signals suggest that the film rewards a rewatch through design more than surprise. Its later revelations matter, but the deeper value lies in recognizing that the instability was present before anyone could name it. The early rooms are not simply neutral spaces awaiting a twist. The framing, sound, performance, and tiny spatial deviations are already teaching us that familiarity can survive after continuity has failed. The full meaning of those patterns depends on what the final descent reveals about imitation, memory, and the cost of demanding that the maze return a human answer. That explanation belongs beyond the spoiler warning. For now, the important signal is this: the backrooms do not need to hide their nature completely. They only need to make each warning look ordinary until the viewer has already trusted it. From this point on, the ending, the reveals, and their meaning are all on the table. If you want the film unspoiled, pause here and come back after you've seen it. The decisive turn begins before Mary enters the labyrinth. Clark's second expedition has already converted curiosity into responsibility. He brings Kat and Bobby with him because a recording can validate what Mary refused to accept. But the attempt to create proof gives the backrooms more lives to absorb. Bobby is lowered into a lower space filled with discarded clothing, including an impossible duplicate of something connected to him. The detail matters because the maze is no longer merely repeating architecture. It is demonstrating that it can reproduce traces of a person before that person understands what is being taken. When the hidden presence seizes Bobby, the film does not treat his loss as a random punishment for entering the wrong room. His death is the direct consequence of Clark turning uncertainty into a workplace expedition. Clark claimed authority without possessing knowledge. He placed another person at the end of a rope and behaved as though physical preparation could compensate for metaphysical ignorance. The rope creates an image of control, but it also reveals how narrow that control is. Clark can pull Bobby upward only while the environment accepts the arrangement. Kat follows because the person she cares about has disappeared and the group breaks apart. Her response mirrors what Mary will later do for Clark. Both women cross a boundary after someone else because leaving would feel like abandonment. The repetition is important. The backrooms do not only reproduce rooms. The story reproduces the emotional decision that draws one person into another person's danger. Clark survives, but uses the catastrophe to rewrite his responsibility. Bobby and Kat become evidence of the place's power rather than evidence of his failure. He acknowledges the loss without accepting the choices that produced it. The opening footage with Naren becomes clearer as well. What first appeared to establish mood and history now reveals that Clark's discovery was never unique. A sink had already entered, lost people, and continued studying the dimension. Clark interpreted the doorway as a personal summons because he needed one. Mary enters after hearing Clark's message and recognizing that his language has shifted from fascination to permanent withdrawal. She follows him not because she suddenly accepts every claim he made, but because his disappearance creates an obligation she cannot emotionally leave unresolved. Her journey completes the pressure established in the therapy room. She once asked Clark to revisit a painful relationship through controlled role play. Now she enters the uncontrolled environment he has used to rebuild that relationship around himself. Clark finds her before she can understand the root. He restrains her and brings her to a dining room assembled from familiar domestic parts. The room is one of the film's most important revelations because it shows what the backrooms do with memory. They do not preserve a complete past. They reconstruct the impression of a past using incomplete information. The table, occupants, and domestic arrangement are recognizable enough to suggest a household, but their errors make the scene feel less like a home than a memory trying to impersonate one. The humanoid still lifes seated around Clark are not ordinary survivors, they are approximations. Their bodies carry the general idea of people without the precise individuality that makes a person legible. Clark accepts them because precision is no longer what he wants. He wants company that cannot contradict his account of himself. Their incompleteness becomes useful. A damaged copy cannot demand the accountability that a real relationship requires. This is why Clark's supposed peace is so disturbing. He claims to have found a place where he belongs, yet the home he has built depends on captivity, imitation, and the removal of disagreement. He has not escaped loneliness. He has created a version of social life in which every other presence has been stripped of the power to leave him. The revelation of Kat's fate closes the moral distance Clark has tried to maintain. Clark can live near the consequence because he has converted the people he endangered into parts of the environment. The maze remembers them badly, and he remembers his responsibility selectively. He then forces Mary back into the therapeutic exercise about his marriage. This is the full inversion of their earlier sessions. In Mary's office, role play was meant to create distance from anger so Clark could examine it. In the backrooms, he uses the same structure to eliminate distance. He does not want exploration, he wants a verdict. He wants Mary in the role of the absent wife to confirm that he was injured rather than responsible. The film's central character choice occurs when Mary refuses that assignment. She stops protecting Clark from the conclusion he has spent the entire story avoiding. His failed marriage, damaged business, and isolation cannot all be explained by a hostile world that misunderstood him. His pain may be genuine, but pain does not cancel agency. Her refusal introduces a human boundary into a room built to prevent them. Clark finally agrees to release her, but his decision remains compromised. He does not choose to return with Mary. He chooses to let her leave while he stays. This is not complete self-recognition. It is a negotiated surrender in which he preserves the fantasy that the backrooms can still become his home. He accepts that Mary will not validate him, yet he remains unwilling to test his new understanding in the ordinary world where repair would require sustained action. Then the creature arrives, and its form resolves the visual pattern established by Clark's furniture advertisements. The towering life form is a distorted version of Captain Clark, the pirate mascot he used to sell furniture through exaggerated confidence and comic authority. The costume once let Clark perform confidence for customers. Inside the backrooms, that performance has become physical and uncontrollable. Pirate Clark is not simply an evil duplicate, it is Clark remembered as an image rather than a person. The maze reproduces the loud posture, commercial costume, anger, and appetite for control, but it cannot reproduce reflection with the same clarity. It resembles the version of Clark he repeatedly projected, stripped of vulnerability. Clark's fatal error is to believe recognition creates kinship. He approaches the creature as though accepting it will prove that he has integrated the worst part of himself. But naming a destructive impulse is not the same as changing the behavior that feeds it. He tries to turn self-knowledge into another performance of mastery. The copy rejects that performance and kills him. The event completes his arc with cruel precision. Clark dies after treating an imitation as though it must share his purpose because it shares his appearance. Familiarity becomes the final trap. He recognizes the image and mistakes recognition for relationship. A less psychological reading remains possible. The life form may attack because it is a dangerous organism, not because the maze has arranged a moral execution. Parsons leaves room for that uncertainty, yet the narrative placement gives the death unavoidable thematic force. Clark is destroyed at the exact moment he believes he can live peacefully beside the form created from his own projection. Whether the creature understands the symbolism is irrelevant. The film does. Mary's escape carries the argument into memory. Pirate Clark pursues her through spaces that begin borrowing from her childhood. The maze shifts from Clark's false domestic arrangement toward fragments of the home she has never fully left behind. Earlier scenes established the demolition of that house, her mother's isolation, and the preserved handprint in the driveway. Those details first appeared to explain Mary's need to rescue people who withdraw from the world. In the climax, they become architecture. This is the full answer to the rewatch signals. The backrooms have been collecting more than physical layouts. They absorb impressions, objects, gestures, and emotional associations, then rebuild them without complete context. The duplicated clothing around Bobby, the showroom echoes, Clark's pirate image, Mary's neighborhood, and the altered interrogation room all belong to the same process. The maze remembers, but memory inside it is reconstruction rather than preservation. Mary carries a piece of the old driveway with the handprint embedded in it. The object has functioned as a portable relationship to the past, proof that the home existed, proof that she existed inside it, and proof that something survived demolition. During the pursuit, she uses it to resist the creature. The object changes function. A relic carried as evidence of an unresolved past becomes a tool that helps her continue moving. Mary does not defeat trauma in one action. She uses the past without allowing it to define the entire route ahead. Clark wanted the backrooms to validate his history. Mary uses an object from hers to create distance from the distorted identity chasing her. One character asks memory to become a home, the other uses memory to survive leaving one. Her route appears to return her to the furniture store, but the geography remains uncertain. It may be the original location, a copied layer, or a transitional area connected to a sink's operation. This uncertainty matters because escape is no longer a simple movement from supernatural space into normal reality. The ordinary world has already been studying, entering, and enclosing the backrooms through institutional systems. A sink personnel capture Mary and bring her to an interrogation room where Phil finally explains the organization's place in the story. The company once worked with medical imaging and shifted its focus after discovering the dimension. A sink moved from imaging hidden interiors to investigating a hidden space that contains distorted images of human memory. Phil offers a tentative model rather than a complete solution. The backrooms behave like an echo chamber for remembered places and people. They reproduce what has entered their field, but the result is incomplete because memory itself does not store a perfect, continuous world. The explanation clarifies without closing the mystery. We learn what the rooms appear to do, not why they exist or who controls them. The interrogation also reveals that Mary has not reached safety in any meaningful emotional sense. Phil does not reassure her that she can leave. His questions reduce her experience to data, while the sterile room repeats the same institutional blankness found inside the maze. A sink believes it is studying the backrooms from outside, but its methods reproduce the architecture of containment. Mary has escaped one system that converts people into incomplete copies and entered another that converts people into information. The final descent through layers of remembered space culminates in a distorted Mary seated inside a recreated version of the interrogation room. This image supports two strong readings. In the first, the real Mary escaped, but the backrooms retained enough of her to produce a still life. She is physically outside, while an imperfect memory of her remains trapped within the endless structure. The place has learned her appearance and begun extending her history through rooms she may never see. In the second reading, the apparent escape may itself be a reconstruction. The woman speaking with Phil could be a copy imagining an institutional explanation because the backrooms absorbed enough context to build one. The calm expression and unstable spatial transition leave open the possibility that no reliable boundary has been crossed. The first reading is stronger for me because the film has established a sync independently through Phil's earlier surveillance. His recognition of Clark's commercial and the organization's existing research suggests that the interrogation belongs to the external plot, not only Mary's copied consciousness. Yet the alternative matters because the film deliberately makes the real room and the copied room visually comparable. Even successful escape cannot restore the old confidence that appearance confirms location. The ending answers the deep view question by separating familiarity from truth. Every major character trusts a recognizable form too far. Clark trusts architecture, therapy language, domestic arrangement, and finally his own image. Mary trusts care as a reason to continue, then discovers that even rescue can lead into institutional capture. A sync trusts observation and measurement, although its growing map may be another partial model of something that changes as it is studied. The film does not claim that interpretation is useless. Mary survives because she recognizes differences Clark refuses to see. She understands that a copy is not a relationship, that pain is not innocence, and that memory can be carried without becoming a permanent room. What the ending rejects is the belief that interpretation grants ownership. Understanding a pattern does not make the system obey. That is what the film ultimately earns. Its human drama is not always as complete as its spatial design, and some symbolic connections arrive more directly than the atmosphere requires. Yet the climax joins Clark's performed identity, Mary's preserved memory, the still lifes, a sync's research, and the maze's shifting architecture into one coherent pressure. The desire to make an incomplete image stand in for a complete person. The backrooms are dangerous because they return what the characters recognize. They offer a home without relationship, a self without reflection, a memory without continuity, and knowledge without freedom. Escape remains possible, but no one leaves with the old assumption that the familiar world is therefore the real one. What remains after the explanations is not the creature, the corporate experiment, or even the endless yellow corridors. It is the image of Mary carrying the broken piece of driveway with the handprint still embedded in it. The object is small enough to hold, heavy enough to slow her, and emotionally large enough to contain an entire relationship to the past. It comes from a home that no longer exists, yet its surface preserves the simplest possible evidence that someone was once there. That image stays because it refuses the easy language of closure. Mary does not destroy the past, solve it, or leave it neatly behind. She carries a fragment. The film understands that memory rarely survives as a complete room. It survives as texture, pressure, a repeated sound, an object whose meaning changes depending on who is touching it and why. The backrooms reconstruct people and places from incomplete traces, but Mary has been doing a human version of that throughout her life. She has preserved one fragment so carefully that it has become part of how she understands responsibility. When she finally uses that fragment to create distance from the distorted figure pursuing her, the film does not turn memory into a magical answer. The object does not explain the maze. It does not restore the demolished house or repair what happened inside it. It simply stops being only a relic. For one moment, Mary uses the past without submitting to its original shape. That distinction is the emotional afterimage of Backrooms. Clark wants the impossible place to confirm that his suffering has made him significant. He builds a false home from copies because copies cannot challenge the story he needs to believe. Mary also carries an unfinished history, but her path moves in the opposite direction. She begins with the idea that preserving connection means refusing to leave anyone behind. By the end, survival requires her to accept that understanding another person does not give her the power to choose for them. The film leaves a difficult human question open. When does care become captivity? Clark wants to be understood so completely that disagreement feels like betrayal. Mary wants to help so completely that another person's disappearance becomes a demand she must follow. Both impulses begin in recognizable emotional needs. Both become dangerous when they erase the boundary between compassion and control. This is where the movie grows after reflection. Its mythology is intriguing, but mythology alone is not what gives the ending weight. The idea of an endless dimension that copies memory can support countless stories, creatures, institutions, and explanations. The feature becomes more specific when it treats copying as a failure of relationship. A reproduction can preserve appearance while losing consent, history, contradiction, and change. It can look like home while removing everything that made home alive. There is also a sound attached to that afterimage. The electrical hum begins as a feature of the maze, then becomes a condition the audience learns to tolerate. Its persistence is uncomfortable, yet it also supplies continuity. When the tone changes or falls away, the absence feels more dangerous than the noise. That pattern mirrors the film's treatment of damaged relationships. A familiar pressure can become so constant that losing it feels like losing orientation. Clark would rather remain inside a harmful certainty than return to a world where he must rebuild without it. Mary's movement is harder because she has to accept silence without immediately filling it with another rescue. The film also shrinks slightly under reflection because several emotional connections are stated more cleanly than they are developed. Mary's history, Clark's marriage, and the younger employee's losses all carry thematic importance, but the screenplay sometimes moves from evidence to meaning before the characters have accumulated enough independent life. The architecture invites prolonged attention. Some of the relationships feel built to deliver a conclusion. The ending grows stronger when it is treated not as a final trick about which Mary is real, but as a challenge to the category itself. A copy may possess her face, posture, and enough memory to behave convincingly. The original may still be physically alive. Yet the existence of the copy changes the meaning of survival because identity is no longer protected by uniqueness. The maze can retain an image after the person has gone, and institutions such as a sink may not be equipped to distinguish preserved evidence from a new consciousness. The film wisely leaves that ethical problem unresolved. Destroying a copy might mean erasing an imitation, or it might mean harming something that has begun to experience itself as real. Even so, the final image resists becoming only a diagram of the theme. Whether the Mary inside the copied interrogation room is a retained echo, a developing replacement, or evidence that escape itself remains uncertain, her calmness is more disturbing than panic would be. The copy appears settled inside a structure that has learned how official reality looks. The backrooms no longer need to imitate abandoned corridors, they can imitate explanation. That returns us to the question we began with. Familiarity becomes the most dangerous trap when it stops being a clue and starts becoming permission. Clark recognizes himself and approaches. Mary recognizes a professional room and is contained. A sink recognizes patterns and assumes that measurement creates distance from the thing being measured. In every case, the familiar form lowers resistance before its meaning has been proven. What remains, then, is not the fear that every doorway leads somewhere terrible. It is the quieter suspicion that a doorway can look correct, a room can feel remembered, and a face can appear known while the relationship between them has already disappeared. My personal score for Backrooms is 6.8 out of 10. That score reflects a film with an exceptional command of spatial unease and a less complete command of dramatic depth. Its greatest achievement is the way it converts liminal imagery into a sustained cinematic system. The production design, framing, sound, and controlled visual repetition do not merely recreate an online aesthetic. They make orientation itself feel unreliable. The film gives us enough information to keep thinking and withholds enough certainty to make thought feel unsafe. Its strongest scenes understand that brightness can be more oppressive than darkness. Empty rooms remain visible, which means the audience cannot blame fear on what has been concealed. We search the frame, notice a doorway, compare one corridor with another, and begin building a map in our own minds. The film then reveals how easily that map can become a story we protect even after the space stops supporting it. The limitation that affects the score most is the uneven relationship between the human material and the environment. Clark is a compelling figure because intelligence, humiliation, entitlement, and genuine pain occupy the same performance. Mary gives the story a needed ethical counterweight. Yet their histories sometimes arrive as compressed explanations for choices the screenplay needs them to make. The rooms feel accumulated. Some of the emotional turns feel assigned. That gap prevents the final losses from carrying the full force of the film's visual imagination. Bobby and Kat matter to the moral argument, but they are not developed enough to become equally powerful presences. Mary's family history explains her compulsion to follow Clark, though the transition from professional concern to irreversible descent remains faster than the emotional stakes deserve. Clark's symbolic confrontation is sharply designed, but its meaning is so legible that it briefly reduces the ambiguity the rest of the film protects. The score also separates admiration from total satisfaction. I admire the confidence required to let architecture carry long passages and to resist explaining the mythology into a conventional franchise manual. That confidence deserves credit even where the pacing tests patience. At the same time, ambition cannot substitute for emotional accumulation. The movie asks its ending to hurt, not merely intrigue, and the human groundwork reaches that level only intermittently. The result is a film I respect for its construction more consistently than I connect with its characters. Personal taste also matters here. Viewers who value atmosphere, environmental storytelling, unresolved systems, and images that reward comparison may rate the film higher. The patience of its early passages and the precision of its spatial design will feel purposeful to them. The movie offers room for interpretation without requiring every clue to become a clean answer. Viewers looking for a tightly escalating horror narrative, clear rules, frequent shocks, or fully developed supporting characters may connect less strongly. Their frustration would be fair. Ambiguity is not automatically depth, and repetition becomes effective only when each return changes what is at stake. Backrooms succeeds often enough to justify its method, but not consistently enough to make every quiet passage feel essential. The film is best experienced in a cinema where the scale of the sets and the continuous electrical sound can dominate attention. Its widescreen spaces benefit from being larger than the viewer's immediate field of comfort, and the low, persistent audio pressure becomes harder to dismiss in a controlled room. Still, this is a selective recommendation rather than an urgent theatrical command. Streaming will suit viewers who prefer to pause, compare details, and revisit spatial changes, which is one of the film's genuine strengths. Its rewatch value is solid. A second viewing can reveal changes in objects, spacing, performance timing, and the relationship between the showroom and the deeper maze. The final explanation gives earlier images new context without making them completely transparent. Rewatching is likely to improve the craft appreciation more than the emotional investment, because the design becomes richer while the underwritten relationships remain underwritten. A score of 6.8 is therefore not a dismissal of the film's ambition. It recognizes a distinctive horror feature with an unusually strong visual identity, confident sound work, and a central idea that survives beyond the immediate mystery. It also recognizes that the movie's most fully realized character is still the space itself. The people give that space direction, but they do not always equal its complexity. If this deeper view gave you a new way to read the maze, like the video and subscribe to Cinema Deep View for more long-form film analysis. Now I want to hear where your interpretation leads. Do you think the Backrooms actively build personalized traps from memory, or do the characters create that meaning inside an indifferent environment? And honestly, did the film's patient repetition deepen the fear for you, or did it weaken the story's momentum? That conversation is part of the movie's value. A clear answer would make the labyrinth easier to classify, but disagreement keeps the central tension alive. One viewer may see a predatory intelligence learning how to imitate human experience. Another may see a blank environment reflecting whatever its visitors cannot release. The film leaves enough evidence for both while making neither completely safe. Backrooms is most effective when it leaves those questions inside the architecture instead of locking them behind one explanation. Its imperfections are visible, but so is the precision of the experience it is trying to create. It takes a familiar collection of walls, lights, doors, and empty rooms, then asks how long we would trust their meaning after every guarantee has disappeared. Thank you for looking beyond the surface with me. Until the next film, keep questioning the image that seems easiest to recognize. Cinema Deep View, look closer, and the movie changes.